Well, Heather, we'll start there with the first question. What has your writing journey been like up until this point?
Sure. I think a lot of authors, when you ask them this question, they're like, "Oh, I've been writing since before I've been telling stories before I could even write." Like, it was like I came out with my first novel when I was 6, and that wasn't me. I've always been a really avid reader, and I've read um, in a lot of genres. I was definitely a horse girl, so I read any book that had a horse on the cover. But I read classics from, Anne of Green Gables and The Black Stallion and
Great
all
book.
of those up through fantasy and sci-fi and, historical. And like I read really widely, but I never tried writing. And it wasn't until I was in my early 30s that I was a really big fan of Chloe Neal. She writes the Chicagoland Vampire series, and
Yeah,
she
I just
was
bought
doing a book tour. And I lived in the Twin Cities, and she was coming through. And prior to this, I'd always lived in a small town, and we didn't have authors come through at all. Like that, the idea that that you could go and meet an author was something that was just, I hadn't even considered that. But she was coming through, and so I was like, oh, I really want to go and see her. And so I went, and she talked about how she also didn't start writing until her early 30s. She had gone through a breakup, and she went, and her way of processing it was to read all of the urban fantasy books that she could. And when she got through all of them in her library or her local bookstore, she was like, oh, I think I could write something. And then she went ahead and wrote the Chicagoland Vampires. And I was like, huh, maybe I didn't miss the boat because I didn't write my first book when I was 6, and that I had a little bit of life experience and stuff, at that point. And I thought about that for a couple of weeks. And then I just like, well, I kind of had this idea, and I was like, well, maybe if I just wrote it down, like I'm sure it's a bad idea, but maybe if I just started writing it down a little bit, like maybe that would like I could just tell, like, oh no, like this is not for me. But I wrote like 6 chapters, and I was like, you know what? This isn't so bad, and I was having fun with it. And so I went and I bought a whole bunch of books, like 'cause at that point I was like, well, I don't really know how to write a story. And so I bought a bunch
Yeah.
of books, and stuff, and taught myself and looked up a whole bunch of stuff on story arcs and character arcs and the 3-act structure and all of those kind of things. And I watched about a bazillion hours of YouTube videos, and really worked on my craft, and did that for a couple of years. And really just I didn't really think that I was gonna try to sell it to anybody or do anything like that with it or show it to anybody really. But I have a couple of really good friends, and I was like, well, maybe they could read it. And they were really supportive of me, and they were really encouraged me um, to keep going with it. And so I do refer to that. That's my trunk book. And I was like, like at that point, I was like, oh no, I know where I was messing up in some things. And so I started my second book, and Reliance just kind of came to me fully formed, and
Mm.
the writing of that went a whole lot smoother. And then when I got done writing it, I was about to turn 40, and my husband, for my 40th birthday, wanted to do something kind of big. And so he contacted Alicia Hyder, who's the author of the Soul Summoner series. And
Right.
he's like, hey, my wife is turning 40, and she wrote a book, and she's thinking about going into publishing. And I've heard her talk about you a whole bunch. Would you be willing to do something with her? And she said yes. And so they agreed that we were going to have a Zoom call, and she really kind of walked me through all of the steps of self-publishing versus traditional publishing, and gave me that roadmap that made me a little bit less scared about what self-publishing would be. And then she's really turned into quite a mentor for me since then.
Awesome.
So I'm very grateful to her for kind of nudging me towards self-publishing, and giving me an idea of what that was, how running a business was really going to be, because it's not just writing the book if you're self-publishing. Well, not that it is with traditional publishing, you still have to market and stuff, but that confidence of kind of going in, and because there's so much information, good and bad, online, and you don't really know what you're supposed to do to make a good product. And so that really helped. And then I met some science fiction authors, and we've done like a writing group with each other, and so they've really expanded my sci-fi community, and we kind of help each other with some marketing ideas, and just kind of generally supporting each other. And that really having a community to be involved in was something that was very unexpected. I really had this impression going into publishing that like you sit at your computer all day by yourself and you write a book and that's it. Like you publish it and you push it out and maybe you make some social media posts or whatever, but like that interaction of the community really took me by surprise. And so I'm also very grateful for that group of authors to kind of hold my hand as I stepped into the self-publishing world as well.